Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we're going to end our unit on the 1980s and the early 1990s by talking about foreign policy after the Cold War. Learning targets, only two today, discussing why Bush decides to use force in some situations and not others, and what those situations are. And we'll talk about the Persian Gulf War. So in South Africa, one thing that Bush has to deal with is the system of apartheid, because the South African government is controlled by whites, and they maintain a system of apartheid, which is segregation between blacks and whites. So think of it as our South Africa civil rights movement. And it's an oligarchy. The whites only constitute about 13% of the total population of South Africa, yet they are the ones in charge. And so that doesn't seem really fair. And so Nelson Mandela is the leader of the anti-apartheid movement, and he has been for a long time, and they've kept him imprisoned since 1962 on an island off of South Africa. So protests grow around the world for his release and the end of the apartheid system. And American companies even divest or withdraw their investments from South Africa. So instead of investing and putting money into South Africa, they withdraw investments or divest from South Africa. And so Nelson Mandela, under pressure, is released from jail in 1990, and the apartheid system is dismantled. And during that time, they operate a new government, they become democratic, and Mandela is elected leader in 1994 in South Africa's first free elections. And Nelson Mandela continued to be a leader of peace and human rights in the world, and he just recently died here in 2013 or so. Bush has extensive foreign policy experience. He is let's look at all the positions. He's been the VP to Reagan. He was the director of the CIA, which deals with stuff outside of our borders. And he was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, so dealing with other countries in the United Nations. So one problem he has is the importing of drugs from Latin America. And so groups in Latin America are the ones that supply many of the illegal drugs in the United States. So in his first year as president, Bush invades Panama and arrests this dictator, Manuel Noriega, for allowing this drug trafficking to go on. And overseas in China, the U.S. gets excited because they think that it's going to be an end of communism, because pro-democracy college students stage protests in China's Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And instead of caving to the pressure or even opening a discussion or a dialogue about this democracy, tanks roll into the city and kill hundreds of protesters and imprison many activists. And here is the famous, nobody knows who he is, but he's just Tank Man. And the famous photograph of him defying the tanks and standing in front of them, not letting them into the square. He's later dragged into an alley and shot, and China does not recognize his existence ever. Bush condemns this action, but he does not cut ties to the country altogether. He only gives sanctions or penalties. He cuts arms ties because he knows that maintaining our connection with China, it would be better for our country than just cutting ties altogether. And that's due to his foreign policy experience throughout the past 20 or 30 years before that. In Yugoslavia, this is one of the countries where communism falls, but after that, the nation turns to civil war. And so this is an ethnic civil war about different ethnicities that live in the area, fighting over who's going to control it. Bush does not want to send U.S. troops there because he does not want to get embroiled in another Vietnam-type conflict. But he does back a UN resolution to keep the peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a new country made out of the former country of Yugoslavia. And in East Africa, in Somalia, the Bush administration does decide to act because human rights are involved. And so these human rights, these people are being denied food. Warlords are stealing food and not allowing it to get to the people that it needs. And so Operation Restore Hope helps establish a ceasefire between these rival warlords and deliver food to the starving people. And you can see how one instance where this goes horribly wrong is in the movie Black Hawk Down, a great modern war film if you've ever seen it. I think it came out in about 2003. Now we turn our attention to the Persian Gulf War and the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. So Iraq and Iran have been at war for about 10 years, and Iraq decides to then invade the tiny neighbor of Kuwait. And the man who does this, his name is Saddam Hussein. He's the iron-fisted dictator of Iraq. He's been in power since 1979, and he wants Kuwait's oil. He wants to control their oil. But us and a lot of our allies are concerned that this paranoid leader, if he has that much oil, about 20% of the world's oil reserves, that would give Hussein way too much influence in world affairs for one person. So we're also allied with Saudi Arabia, and we do not want Hussein to take those oil reserves next. So Bush gets on the phones and builds a coalition of people and demands, along with this entire coalition of 30 or so countries, that the Iraqi troops withdraw. And if you don't know where we're talking about this area of the world. You can see Iraq along the border of Saudi Arabia. This is where we amass our troops along the border of Saudi Arabia, waiting to invade Iraq and Kuwait as a part of Operation Desert Storm. So 500,000 U.S. troops are sent there to protect our oil interests. And General Colin Powell and General Norman Schwarzkopf, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell is, they devised this Operation Desert Storm. So starting on January 16th, 1991, America launches 5 weeks of bombing Iraqi forces and Iraqi cities. Iraq begins launching Scud missiles on U.S. forces because we're attacking them, and Israel because they're Jewish, and because they're our allies as well. They do little damage, but we're also fearful that they may be equipped with chemical warheads, because during the Iraq-Iran war, Iraq experimented with chemical weapons on Iranian prisoners and their own people during that time. That's why Saddam Hussein was eventually put to death when they captured him in the 2003 Iraq war. And so after the bombing on February 23rd, coalition troops cross into Kuwait. And Iraqi troops either flee or surrender immediately to these troops. But while they're retreating, they light Kuwaiti oil wells on fire along the way, and this does tremendous damage to the environment, just having these oil wells lit, because it's very, very hard to put out an oil well fire. You essentially have to close the well and basically destroy it in order to get it out. And so it's hard to put these out. You can see them burning. It makes it look like night. It's so black. By the end of the month, Iraq agrees to a ceasefire. They lose 25,000 troops. The United States loses 148. And Bush famously claims we had kicked the Vietnam syndrome, but his son is going to get us involved in Iraq again and basically drag us into another Vietnam-style conflict. So the results of the Persian Gulf War, the coalition forces, or the forces from all of these different countries, would enforce the ceasefire resolution. And if Iraqi forces leave Kuwait, the coalition forces would not continue to Baghdad to remove Hussein from power. So Saddam Hussein and his regime remain in power of Iraq, and it won't be until 2003 that the U.S. invades Iraq again and finally takes Hussein out of power. And so that is the learning targets for this week. Go ahead and fill them out. If you have any questions, bring them back to class, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.